Welcome, Mzansi. You are listening to Farmers Inside Track, proudly brought to you by Foodform Mzansi. Officially, this is the world's best podcast for 2024, as awarded by WANEFRA, the global organization for the world's press. I'm your host, Dawn Numdu. Weekly, we share vital aspects of farm management, sustainability, and innovation. Today, we have a special guest who brings a wealth of knowledge on a topic every farmer needs to understand: water management. Our expert, Dirk Moelman, a seasoned hydrogeologist. In this episode, we'll explore essential questions, such as whether you need a water usage license when pumping a borehole, how to navigate the process of large-scale water abstraction for irrigation, and what it takes to comply with existing water use licenses. Good day, Dirk Moelman. It is such a pleasure to have you join me here on the Farmers Inside Track podcast. And I'm looking forward to picking your brain today. You're the very first hydrogeologist that I've met. And I'm so looking forward to talking about all things water when it comes to agriculture, but also just generally water rights and water usage. Come to it.
Thank you very much for having me today on this podcast. It's nice to meet you as well. Looking forward to having a conversation with you, and hopefully we can share some practical knowledge with everyone today.
Dirk, many of the farmers that I speak to day to day, new developing farmers, even commercial farmers, have challenges when it comes to water use, water rights, pumping boreholes on their farm, understanding what the best irrigation systems are, how to efficiently use this very scarce resource that we have. Either we have too much of it or we have too little of it. That's always the challenge. Maybe you can just give us some context, and then we'll get into the conversation around boreholes and irrigation and water testing as the conversation goes along. Thanks.
As a hydrogeologist, we always look for the farmers we can find and identify the best drilling targets in order to get some resources and to exploit those resources. So then we use techniques like geophysical investigations in order to find preferential flow paths for the water that can flow underground in fractured systems, in the rock systems. And these are not for different geological sequences that we get from where you are in the Western Cape, and especially in the central part of the country. And when we identify these targets for them, we get contractors, the drillers, to drill these boreholes and to see if we can get some sufficient water for these farmers. And if we do have success with these drilling of the boreholes, then we do an aquifer yield test by installing pumps in these boreholes and abstracting them and stressing the aquifer to see how much water this aquifer can deliver. But then we need to, from our side, to make sure that this water must be abstracted on a sustainable amount. So that's one of the most important parts that we must take into consideration, that when we do abstract water from these aquifers, that we do it in sustainable, and usually 5, 6, 7 boreholes on a property, and some of them are located in close proximity of one another. So then it's very crucial to see if these boreholes are connected to one another, and to make sure that we adjust the abstraction volumes to these boreholes to make sure that we don't over abstract this precious resource that we do have. And so that obviously we need to do this sustainable, and we're not here just to farm for 1, 2, 3, or 5 years. We are here to make sure that future generations, that they also have precious resources that they can utilize. Pollution is also a very big factor in South Africa. And then you also need to test this water and to make sure if there are possible pollutants like bacteriological pollutants that come from plants, or sometimes you do get trace elements like your ions and metals. So that's more or less the overview of what we do and how we approach farmers. And then you also need to license this water use. But then that's very technical, that you need to see how much water you are abstracting. And we'll get a little bit into that a bit later on.
Thank you so much for this context, Dirk. And I think my key points would always be, to focus on the sustainability element and understanding that it's not just about today, this week, this year, 2 years. It's about the generations that will come and follow and continue to produce. So I think that element is always a key focus. And I'm so happy to be able to talk to you just about the technical side of it. This is one question, that farmers always ask me around boreholes, what the licensing is around it. So first question is, so do you need a license, for water use when it comes to pumping, from a borehole, if you have an existing borehole on your farm?
Yes, definitely. So that usually fall into different categories, and that's why we always consult the farmer, and we need to know how much he's abstracting. But you only use groundwater or your borehole for your normal domestic use that you use around your house and your garden. And then if you don't use more than 10,000 liters per day, and then you will fall under a Schedule 1 water user that the Department of Water Affairs, they don't request for you to register that water use, as this is not a lot of water that you are abstracting from the resource. However, dependent on your drainage region, where your property is located, how big your property is, and then in relation to your property, how much water you're abstracting, then you can apply for a general authorization under your Section 21A water use license application. But when you have general authorization, you cannot abstract more than 40,000 cubic meters of water per annum. If you abstract more than that 40,000 cubic meters per annum, you will need to do a full water use license that you also need to apply a Section 121A that you apply for at the Department of Water Affairs. But then the department will require a lot of technical investigations that you will need to do, like I've mentioned before, how strong that water is and the yield of those boreholes, and then the water quality of that water resource as well. And then sometimes the department will require some additional specialist studies that must be included. That is everything dependent on where your setting is, how much users are within your local area, and so forth. So there's a lot of things that you need to take into consideration by applying for a water use license. But usually when you need to do a full water use license is when you are planning to do some large scale abstraction from your boreholes. And that's where we also get in and to make sure that we communicate with the department to make sure that this amount of water that's been abstracted is also done on a sustainable method. You definitely need to register your water use with the department as soon as you are abstracting more than 10,000 liters per day.
Dirk, just listening to you going over the paperwork, the kind of requirements that there are, is there a certain timeline?
Yes.
This is a topic that I've had people asking me about, and I really want to get into some of the timelines, but I think there will be room for us to have a longer conversation on perhaps another platform that we also use to share information called Gather to Grow. For now, I want to just stick to some of the processes involved. If you want to do large-scale abstraction from a borehole for irrigation, for example, how does this process specifically work? If you can just take us through that, please, Dirk.
So we test this borehole, we do an aquifer yield test, and from a geological point of view, I make a sustainable abstraction recommendation on this borehole or few boreholes that is located on this property. Then we do the application for this Section 21A water use license application at the department, and I submit a report as well to the department stating how much water this farmer will be abstracting annually. And they will have a look at it, and they will also decide from their side if there are additional information or investigations, like, let's say, for instance, a wetlands delineation and so forth, that must be done on that farm as well. So when the department has a look at it, they have up until 300 days to get back to you and to say what else must be, what is needed. So yes, 300 days, it's a long time. It's still a very, very lengthy process as well. But it can be quicker than 300 days as well. But usually we don't like to give an estimate of earlier time estimates, because we need to give them at least the worst case scenario must be 300 days. So yes, it's a lengthy process.
300 days, Dirk. That's a long time.
That's a long time. And nowadays, everything must be done as quick as possible. And today's life is like the rat race, and everything must be quick and done quickly. But sometimes some processes just take so much more time, and that's just how it is. But it's a lot of work from the department side probably as well. It used to be a year.
No, thanks so much for that context. I think I understand, some farmers' frustration now at the timelines, but I understand also the importance of ensuring that you take the right steps to be able to comply and to get all of it done properly. And I'm so happy to be able to understand it better from your perspective as a hydrogeologist. If I, as a farmer, have an existing water rights license, what must be done to comply? How do I ensure that No one's coming to knock at my door to say, hey, you're using too much, or this is not the proper regulations. What does the compliance actually say for myself as a food producer?
That's one of the things I specialize in is in existing water use licenses. So if you have a look at a water use license, that's a legal binding document that the department issued you with. So when you applied, or the initial company or farmer did a water use license application, all these forms that were submitted with the recommendations from the hydrologist will be stated and will be said that this must be implemented during the lifespan of the abstraction. So that will be incorporated within your water use license, and that will always vary from one user to another. All of the information will be stated in that water use license. It's easy to have a look at it and say, yes, you must do X, Y, and Z that's stated here in this legal binding document to assure that you are still a legal user from the water rights that you have applied for and that you actually own. So that's very, very important to stay within the terms of that water license that's been issued. If someone asks questions or the department decide to have a look at what's happening there, then everything must be in order. And usually you guys can get into a lot of trouble if you do not comply with it. The process has been done, and then you need to make sure that you implement this license. But from my side, it's obviously much easier to interpret it than someone that does not work with this every day. So when I have a look at it, it's easy to see what you must do and what you must implement in order to comply with it. It's actually a very important document that you do own and must pay attention to it as well.
Thanks so much for sharing the importance of compliance. I think that's key for anyone running a formal agricultural business, even for everyone who's using water and has a bore, all of those things, the importance of, just having access to it and that it is regulated is important for sustainability. Dirk, I want to shift the conversation to more, testing of water. If you can just take us through the basic tools that are needed to test, for example, pH, electrical conductivity, dissolved oxygen in farm water, and how do these readings help determine if water is suitable for crops and the soil as well? If you can just take us through that, and even if you can just explain each of those elements, because I literally had to Google them myself as well.
Yes, as these different elements can also get very, very complicated, but your pH and EC can give you a quick estimate of what your water quality is looking like. You can easily go online. You can purchase these handheld pH and EC measurement tools that you can just put in the water, and it can give you an indication of what the pH or the electrical conductivity is. According to the SUNS accreditation limits, there are limits that shouldn't be over it. Let's say, for instance, the electrical conductivity, if it's under 100 millisiemens per meter, then it's within the standards. And obviously, you can't have a pH of 3. So that won't work for you if you get a reading like that. But as far as the water quality goes, you need to do a lot more testing in order to see if this water is safe for human and livestock consumption. And if you want to, you can use it for irrigation. So as I've indicated, bacteriological contamination, E. coli, as we all know this, that you read a lot about it in the media as well. If you wanted to test for bacteriological contamination, that might be coming from pit latrines or a sewage plant that you're suspecting it from, then you need to submit that to a SANAS accredited laboratory. These tests are quite pricey as you submit it to a laboratory. Also have a consultant to help you with that to make sure you request the right analysis that must get done at the laboratory. And so usually then you will test for E. coli and plate count and total coliforms for bacteriological contamination. However, it can get a lot more complicated if you want to check for trace elements and the physical properties of the water. So you can split that into the two different sectors, the bacteriological and the physical properties of your water that you can analyze. But you can also submit that to an accredited laboratory as well. But also, as you said, you had to Google this beforehand. And we are only discussing about 5 variants that you can analyze, but you can analyze up to 30, 40 elements that you can analyze for to cover all of the bases to make sure that this water is within the standards for drinkable usage or irrigation usage. And if there is maybe possible pollutants that you are irrigating onto your crops. So that's always, to properly do it, is to send it to an accredited laboratory and to make sure that you analyze for all of the correct elements as well.
Thanks so much for that context, Dirk. And I understand that it is a lot more complicated than what we can read or understand on paper. And maybe there's so much more that we can discuss on the topic. But I think the important part is for farmers to understand is, why is it important to check for harmful bacteria like E. coli, like you mentioned, in irrigation water? How can farmers know when the levels are too high and if it can cause harm to either crops or livestock? I mean, for me, the traceability, and it is food that we eat, that we consume, that goes into our body. So if it's harmful, then that's a no-no. So what should farmers understand from day one?
If the water is contaminated, it's also set out by the Department of Water Affairs what the effects can be if you have, like, let's say, high nitrates or potassium or fluoride usually in your water. And especially a big problem is the E. coli. And your people or animals can get very, very sick consuming this water. It's very important to know what you are drinking and what you are giving your livestock as well. What we've seen, for interest's sake, usually when you have a borehole with a windmill and next to it, you always will see a dam and watering place for the livestock usually. But then the watering point is usually located right next to the borehole. And then these elements, especially nitrates and bacteria, can infiltrate through the soil in the aquifer. And that goes actually into the borehole that you are pumping and giving to the farm animals as well. So that's also dependent on the type of soil that you have there. If it's clay soils, then it will make the flow of these pollutants very slower. But if you have sandy soils, but a lot of these elements can infiltrate to the aquifer that they are watering right next to the borehole. It's normal practice that you always have a small submersible solar pump or a windmill with the watering point right next to it, because the cost is too high to take it to another place usually. So that's just an interesting fact that we usually see, and that you are actually having effect on that local aquifer that they are actually consuming as well. And we don't tend to think of it that way and every day.
Alongside that, Dirk, it's also, understanding that we need to test for essential nutrients like nitrates, phosphates, and potassium in water. What should be done if the levels are either too low or too high for the plants?
Especially for nitrates, potassium, trace elements like iron, lead, that's a very, very tricky one to be able to take that out of water. Then you usually get water treatment specialists to advise you to get this out of the water. But as I'm not a water treatment specialist, it's a very tricky thing to get out of it, especially like lead, arsenic as well. Sometimes we are pumping from two different water resources. The one resource has a high value, the other one has a low value. Then you can usually mix these two and even it out with a drinkable standard. But just to take it out is quite complex. It's not the same when you have bacteriological contamination. When you have bacteriological contamination, then you can usually just chlorinate the water and then you can kill these bacteria and make it usable for consumption. So that's not usually too tricky to treat for bacteriological contamination. But yes, definitely much more trickier for trace elements and nitrates, phosphates, and potassium.
What can water testing also reveal about potential pests or diseases that might affect crops? And how can this information be used to protect the farm?
I know, especially for the chicken hatcheries and chicken farming, those farmers, they need to test for these bacteriological contaminants as well, where that is a very, very important part for them because it can wipe out an entire hatchery. So it's always best to know beforehand what you are working with and what you are giving to the animals. It can be devastating for a farmer if there is a breakout. Even though just for another example, when you are even taking municipal water and you are storing it in tanks for up to a few days or to have a buffer, then you cannot also take the municipality to be liable for that water because you are generating a new storage facility and then you must be held liable for how you are storing that water and to make sure that that water that you are storing and using again, that must be safe for usage as well.
Thank you so much for that context, especially around the municipal water usage and also the storage, because the responsibility around that I never actually thought about that element of it as well.
That was quite interesting for me because I had this discussion with one of the owners of a laboratory, and they indicated that it makes sense that you cannot hold the municipality accountable for that water that you are storing. And you can have tanks that's not cleaned, or that there are pollutants going into those tanks, and they cannot be held accountable for that. So yes, that was quite interesting for me as well. I learned it not long ago. So that was some good additional information for me as well.
Absolutely amazing. And so happy that we're able to share it with our farmers and everyone else who's listening to this podcast as well across South Africa, but also globally. Thank you so much for that. Maybe my last question to you would be around, how regularly water testing should be done. And, especially when it comes to ensure that, farm runoffs, including, polluting, nearby rivers or lakes. And, what are the specific tests that should be conducted to monitor this on a regular basis?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity today, Dawn. I also really appreciate the exposure here on your platform for today as well. With regards to the testing and how frequently to do it, usually for thumbsuck, we work with groundwater monitoring. We usually recommend quarterly monitoring, so it's every 3 months that you sample and send analysis to the laboratory. However, for what you are testing, it's also dependent on what you are looking for. So if you maybe have a feedlot that you are operating, then it will be very important to analyze for nitrates, for the urine that can leach into the groundwater, and obviously for the possible bacteriological contaminants like your E. coli. It's actually quite logical when you think about it. Then for surface water, you can sample anything from weekly to monthly, because the water flow and the variables is much quicker than in groundwater. As groundwater, it actually flows very slow through the aquifer, and your surface water, what's here today, can be downstream 100 meters or kilometers from this current point. So the water quality varies a lot with your surface water, and then you can sample much more frequently in order to ensure that the water quality is within spec. But usually when you operate feedlot as well, then it depends also what your environmental authorization requires for you to sample an analysis and what analysis to get done. That's more or less how we approach it, but it's always, again, site-specific and what the conditions are on the site and the farm that you are operating currently.
Are there any other key elements that you think is important, for food producers to understand before we wrap up the interview? And then also, how do people contact you, reach you for more additional information? Thanks.
It depends on what farmer's situation is. And from my experience, you must always be on the lookout. People usually talk about a lot of water, and there's a lot of water, or it's very clean or very dirty. We must always measure it and do the tests that's required to make sure that the claims that are made are factual, and that you don't just say, no, my water is dirty, or I have a lot of water. But we need to know, and we need to quantify in order to see where you fit into the regulations. I'm always available via WhatsApp on my telephone number or by a call. My telephone number is 084-2086-456, and my company's name is Novacraft Groundwater Consultants. The email address that I use is my name and surname. It's Dirk, DIRK C Moolman, MOOLMAN @gmail.com. Hopefully you can maybe state that in the subject as well. Anyone can contact me on any of those details and can discuss the issues or plans that you want to make. I know that farmers are very innovative and they want to make plans and see what extra they can do and what resources they can develop. And then I can assist them with all of the questions that they have or plans that they are making, and to be able to help them with that.
Thank you so much for your insights, hydrogeologist Dirk Moolman. Whether you're dealing with the complexities of licensing or just want to make sure that your irrigation water is up to standard, I trust this podcast was helpful. For more insights on optimizing your agricultural practices, visit www.foodformzansi.co.za. Remember to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with fellow agriculture enthusiasts. From me, Dawn Numdu, our technical producer Megan van der Vent, and the rest of the hashtag Team #FoodFormZansi, until next time, happy farming.
Life in South Africa can be a lot. Scroll through Twitter for a minute and tell me I'm wrong. Thank God for South Africans though, right? We're inspiring, and even on the bad days, we fight back with a smile. That's why I love Food for Mzansi so much. They're not ashamed to celebrate the ordinary unsung heroes who work every day to put food on our nation's tables. Go to foodformzansi.co.za and never miss an inspiring story.